For a good debate today, albeit a bit one-sided, I find myself quite often questioning, sometimes what are the points of these debates when all of us show up to talk about, what happens in terms of our constituency surgeries, and yet the only two members from the Conservative Party here are compelled to be here. There are new, what they call red wall MPs from the Conservative Party. I mean, surely, Mr Pritchard, their surgeries, they have people coming to them about the punitive sanctions regime, and I think it ill behoves any of them who seek to stand for re-election, who don't bother their backside to turn up here and talk about the very thing that we know impacts many of our constituents. Now, my honourable friends' debate is certainly a timely one, not least because recent data produced by the Scottish Parliament Information Centre shows that benefit sanctions for young Scots have nearly doubled since 2019, the last comparable year for such statistics. And the British Government certainly likes to talk ad nauseum about its rather underwhelming Kickstart programme. However, these statistics show that the DWP is only seeking to kick young people when they're down. But I shall return to this slightly later in the wider context of the debate we're having today. But my honourable friend has already made reference to the figures that he uncovered via parliamentary questions. Certainly in my own constituency of Glasgow East, £55,000 was deducted from universal credit payments in the month of August alone, simply as a result of benefit sanctions. And at a time when businesses are struggling, and we've all just celebrated Small Business Saturday over the last week or two, I would remind the House that that is cash that could have been spent at small businesses in the likes of Parkhead, Barrowfield and Lillybank. So if the Conservative Party don't get that from necessarily a compassionate aspect, they should look at it from the point of view purely of economics. But instead, the DWP has pressed ahead with a regime of conditionality which pushes people into destitution, something that, frankly, Mr Pritchard, the state ultimately bears the cost for anyway. So I would argue that it is actually short-sighted in that respect. But even more eye-watering is the Scotland-wide figure for deductions from UC by way of sanctions, which was £2.3 million alone in the month of August this year. And as I've already said, that destitution is not cost-free for the state, and there is already a very rich body of evidence out there from the likes of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which shows the true cost of, for example, homelessness as people are pushed into destitution by a failing social security system. And whilst 85% of welfare spending in Scotland is reserved to this institution, the Scottish Government is, I believe, doing its level best to mitigate against the very worst effects of Westminster's assault on benefits. But whether you're a unionist or a nationalist, I think we can surely all agree, Mr Pritchard, that devolution, be it in Wales, Northern Ireland, or indeed Scotland, cannot simply just be a sticking plaster for inadequate social security policies designed in Whitehall. For example, in Scotland, the government in Edinburgh spends £80 million a year of its devolved budget every single year on discretionary housing payments purely to nullify Westminster's bedroom tax. Yeah. To be blunt, that is £80 million that could be spent on health and education, but the Scottish Government are having to spend trying to clean up the mess that's been caused by Westminster. Indeed, using our limited social security powers, next year the Scottish Government will spend an extra £311 million on the game-changing Scottish Child payment of £25 a week. That is in stark contrast to the British Government's outrageous two-child policy and associated rape clause. But you can begin to see a pattern emerging here, Mr Pritchard, because in essence, DWP policy means that devolved Peter is being robbed to pay the price of reserved Paul. And the same is true with the sanctions regime that my honourable friend has been highlighting today. Sanctions combined with deductions from universal credit mean that almost £2 billion per annum is snatched away from the very poorest people on these islands, and that's when, faced with going hungry, the third sector, which is already close to breaking point, then needs to step in and pick up the pieces. And to illustrate that, I'll give you an example from one constituency. The Halliday Foundation helps people in poverty with free meals and furniture as they seek to rebuild their lives. Now, they're funded by local government, which in turn is funded by central government. So all that happens is that central government sanctions a constituent, and then the Halliday Foundation has to step in to support my constituent with the financial resources that's been provided by local government. I mean, put simply, this is a total mess, and I would argue is also a complete waste of taxpayers' money, and shows that moving people into destitution is something that the government only bears the cost for anyway. But there's also an additional negative dimension to sanctions relevant very much just now, which I want to highlight to the Minister and back up the point made by my honourable friend from Glasgow South West, because data shows that almost 700 Scottish households were denied the first £326 cost of living payment in September simply as a result of sanctions. And so let me be very clear to the Minister that the freezing temperatures that we are experiencing at the moment, they don't bypass houses and say, oh, well, we'll not go to -7 degrees just because that house has been sanctioned. And so I would argue that the decision to exempt sanctioned individuals from the cost of living payment is wrong, and it should be put right without delay. In my 5 years of being a member of this House, it has become clear to me that Whitehall does not know best when it comes to designing a strong, robust and compassionate social security net. Indeed, ministers and senior officials who preside over this disastrous sanctions regime clearly don't understand what it is like to sit in the room of a cold library in Glasgow's East End on a Friday morning, speaking to constituents who literally have nothing to live on. Just on Friday at my surgery, I met a constituent from Greenfield who is a kinship carer for his grandson. We've had debates in this chamber about the importance of kinship carers and actually the vast amounts of money that they save the government. But our failing social security system means that state support is so low that my constituent told me on Friday that he has rationed his primary school age grandson to just 2 baths a week because he cannot afford the energy bills. And Mr Pritchard, the very fact that my constituent could tell me that it costs 70 pence to run a hot bath shows just how close to the breadline that man is living and how much our social security system is failing people who need it most. Indeed, he told me he cannot afford to turn on the Christmas tree lights for fear of running up an energy bill that he simply cannot afford, not least because he is on a prepayment meter. And Mr Pritchard, these are the sorts of people that are impacted by the actions of a Department of Work and Pensions, which day after day plunge the very most vulnerable people in our constituencies into abject poverty, something which I believe should shame the 5th richest economy in the world. This government has the absolute temerity to prance around the world on its Brit-branded ministerial plane, preaching about global Britain, all the while constituents in my constituency literally cannot afford to run a hot bath the night before sending his grandson to school. It is utterly, utterly shameful. And my honourable friend from Glasgow South West has outlined a better way of doing things, perhaps via the yellow card warning system. And ministers would do well to engage with us on ameliorating a system which currently is doing so much harm. Indeed, it's no wonder that the Glasgow Centre for Population Health has attributed over 330,000 excess deaths in the UK to austerity since 2010. And it has long been the case that governments of both colours in this House have talked a tough game on welfare. I certainly prefer to call it social security, but the cat is now firmly out of the bag because for too many people who had no understanding or experience of benefits, the pandemic lifted a veil on a social security system which has been found to be utterly, utterly inadequate. We know from polling that the public will no longer buy into this lazy picture painted by politicians in London of this being a fight between strivers versus skivers. This is now firmly a fight of abject poverty versus fairness and decency. And the only way to ensure that fairness and decency wins is to end the punitive benefit sanctions regime and build a proper, robust social security system which is underpinned by dignity, with human rights and with respect. Mr Pritchard, in Scotland we've already started that journey, but in truth most Scots know that it can only be completed with the full powers of independence. And I've got to say, nothing in this debate that I've heard today, and indeed in my time in this House, convinces me that with Westminster the sanctions regime would end. And that's why Scotland can, should and must make its own decisions on all social security, as with other policies. Because for us, Westminster is not working, and we all know that that's why Labour and the Conservatives are petrified of Scottish democracy prevailing.